Hey everyone, this is Kevin from thechesswebsite.com. Before we get into today's video, I want to let everyone know we have a new Facebook page. I'm going to put the link in the description below, but it takes just a minute if you wouldn't mind liking that for me. Brand new page, but it's got some really great content. So thank you guys. We'll go ahead and get into the video. Today we're going to be starting our series on the 2014 Candidates Tournament. One of my favorite tournaments, has the top players in the entire world fighting for a chance to play the champion Magnus Carlsen at the end of the year. Each day I'm going to be doing coverage, taking, in my opinion, the best game of the day or a particular game that I just thought was very interesting that you could learn a lot from. Today's game is going to be featuring two of the top players. We have Vishy Anand going to be playing the white pieces. Anand, obviously the player that was the previous world champion, just lost to Anand a few months ago, and his opponent playing the black pieces is Aronian, the number 2 ranked player behind Magnus Carlsen in the world. The favorite by a lot of people to win this tournament, my favorite actually to win the tournament. I think he's just the best player in the field right now, so definitely going to be interesting. Another reason that I want to do this particularly is because there's the anti-Marshall in this opening. I actually made a Marshall video attack video not too long ago, so I thought it was pretty cool that I make a video and then a couple weeks later we have the top pros actually playing that, so it gives a little more insight into what we're doing. So we'll go ahead and get started. The Marshall attack starts out in the Rye Lopez close. We have e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop to b5. Again, this is the Rye Lopez kicking the bishop back. Knight to f6, castle, bishop here to e7, getting ready to castle on the king side. The rook swinging over, weakness here on e4. Pawn to b5, pushing the bishop back, and the king coming back here. And then white having to decide what he wants to do. Now, in the Marshall attack, we have pawn to c3, and then the pawn pushing forward to d5. This is the attack from black. White has a few options. One would be to attack on the queen side with pawn to a4. This is one way to play the anti-Marshall attack, but it does get pretty tricky. Black can now respond with pawn to b4. This threatens a lot of the squares that the knight would like to come to. Knight to a3, knight to c3. It gets a little cramped for white. Another option that we have is exactly what Anand played. He plays pawn here to h3. Somewhat of a waiting move, recognizing his opponent's going to be playing pawn here to d5, but it does allow him a little bit more room than playing the pawn here to c3. Black responds with bishop here to b7, getting ready to attack the center of the board. We now see pawn to d3. Since this light bishop has come outside the pawn chain, it's come over here, controlling this long diagonal. It's now okay to play pawn to d3. Can solidify this pawn chain, open up the door for the bishop to get out if he wants to. Also has another way for this knight to come on board if he wants to. So a lot of different options by playing this pawn here to d3. Black pushes forward, as we talked about, with pawn to d5. This is kind of the goal for black, to give up some material early on into the game so he can control the center, give white a very cramped position, and then try to find some weakness in white's position. So white's going to capture, black's going to recapture, and now white has the opportunity now to go ahead and take this pawn because he has two attackers, his knight and his rook here on e1. White decides to kind of delay that and first play knight to d2, which is somewhat interesting. Black now has a few more options. He could play knight to f4, definitely a possibility. He decides in this particular game to play queen to d7, which is interesting. It does complete his development, so that's good. But it does still, again, leave this pawn here on e5, and it has a somewhat awkwardly placed knight here still on d5. So the knight's going to take on e5 as we talked about, and then after the other knight takes, then we're going to have the rook swing up here and take on e5, and black is now black is now down in material. Now we're going to have the knight swing back here to f6, and then we have the rook coming back here to e1. So if we kind of analyze this position from both sides, it's kind of what we talked about before. White is up material. He's one central pawn up, but white has a very cramped position on this board. It's very difficult for him to get many of his pieces developed. This rook here on a1 is not going to be doing anything for a long time. This dark square bishop's not going to be moving anywhere great. This knight's even somewhat awkwardly placed. Doesn't really want to come here to c4 or even e4 So going to be looking to come to f3 if it goes anywhere, and then this dark square bishop can get involved. This queen is not very centralized. It's not doing too much. This rook's just kind of hanging out here. It is controlling this long e file, but again, it needs to be a little bit more active. Again, from black's side, very active position. Both the bishops controlling long diagonals. We have the queen very centralized. The rooks are already connected, so we can swing those over to this open d file, or semi-open d file and open e file right here. So both sides doing exactly what they need to do. It really all depends on if Aronian can actually find a weakness in Vishy Anand's defense, or if Vishy Anand can kind of hold on to that material and then find a weakness in Aronian's setup later on and seize control. Black now swings his rook over to e8, again getting his big pieces involved into the action. We now have knight to f3. Again, as we talked about, trying to uncramp the position that white has on board. Now we have bishop here to d6, more centralized than before, also opening up the door for the rook here on e8, so all very good moves. We have bishop to e3, again developing, trying to make sure that white can continue his development. Definitely wants to have more of a centralized bishop right here. Then we have rook to e7, getting ready to swing his rook over to e8. Double barreling here on the e file is going to be good for the rooks. Then we have the pawn pushing forward to d4. Now white had a lot of different options. He could have played a3 if he wanted to. He could have played c3 if he wanted to. A lot of different options. Decided to go with pawn to d4, trying to control the center of the board. Definitely an okay move for him, but again, he had a lot of different options on that board. Rook swinging over to e8 as we talked about before, and then pawn to c3. So this opens up a lot for white. It allows him a lot of different squares for his bishop to get to. It solidifies this pawn chain right here, and it gives him a little bit more breathing room because he can kind of now move his pieces around more so than he had before. Black's definitely going to have to find some room in here to attack, or he's going to get into the late game and he's going to be down material. Black now plays pawn here to h6. Doesn't want to have an awkwardly placed piece here, whether it's the bishop or probably the knight coming over here to g5. And then we have the knight to e5. Pretty interesting move from Anand, deciding to go ahead and give up some material. Doesn't want too much of a cramped position. And as he kind of analyzed this, a lot of players that are using the anti-martial, they recognize the best way to get to an endgame and give them an advantage. And so that's what Anand, I think, saw in this position. He thinks he has an advantage if he gives back that pawn material. And so it's going to be up to Aronian to try to counterattack that and somewhat get into an endgame with the better position, so we can try to come out with a draw or potentially a win for black. So as we go through the motions, black takes. After the pawn takes, the rook's now going to come down and take. The queen takes. The knight now takes. And then we have the rook swing over here to d1. So as we can see, white gave up that central pawn back in material. And so both sides are pretty good on development. They both have two minor pieces on board. Black has both of his rooks here on the e file. White has both of his rooks back here, but he can easily get him involved into the action. Usually you want to have bishops if there's pawns on both sides of the board. They usually play a little bit better because they can get to both sides of the board very quickly. If you have knights, you usually want to keep action on one side of the board because he can control that side of the board very easily compared to hopping to both sides of the board. So in this position, I would give white the slight edge. Really, it could go either way in this position, but I would say white has the slight edge. Now the knight's going to swing over here to f6, and then we have pawn pushing forward to c4. And white's really looking to find a weakness in this pawn chain over here from black. Black does not want to take back here with his pawn because the bishop can take. Now there's going to be these two stranded pawns. They don't have any pawns connected to them, so it's going to be very hard for black to hold on to both of these pawns the rest of the game. So that's kind of what Anand's doing. He's trying to find a kink in the armor. Black does not want to go ahead and do that, so instead he plays pawn here to c6. Not too many great options that he has as far as, waiting to see what white does. Anand now swings his rook over to here to c1. Always want to have your rooks behind your pawns in late game as they push forward. And then we have the rook swinging back over here to e7. Again, probably a little more centralized than he wants to. He still wants to kind of double barrel them, but he does want some safety back here with his rooks. And then pawn to a4. Very, very good move from Anand, as he really puts Aronian to the test as far as what he wants to do. Now, Aronian decides to go ahead and take with his pawn on c4. I think this is probably a pretty bad move. He had some other options. Knight here to e4. Definitely centralizing his knight, opening up a lot of possibilities for black. Again, does not want to give up the fact that he has these pawns connected right here. All of a sudden, if he plays pawn to c4, he gives up everything that we kind of talked about. So I feel like this is definitely a bad move from black. Definitely is the opportunity that Anand has been waiting for. So it really just depends on how both sides can execute from here. Anand decides to go ahead and take. So again, he has this A and B pawn connected potentially here. And then black is kind of forced to just play defense here and try to hold on to these pawns, since the pawns can't protect themselves. So then we have the knight come over here to d5, centralized, nice little outpost. The bishop's going to swing in, again more centralized, attacking the rook. The rook is forced to move. Then we have the pawn push forward. This also gives a little bit of breathing room for white's king. Can also get involved now. As you approach the end game, moving away from the middle game, you actually want to use your king as more of an offensive piece. So this kind of does two things. One, it attacks the rook, but also it allows for this king to go ahead and come to f2, e3 potentially, and centralize and even move down the board if he needs to. Now we have the rook swing back, and then the king's going to come to f2 as we talked about. The bishop's going to come back here to c8. Definitely wants to do more than just defend, but again, it still is on defending duty right now. The bishop's going to come back here to f1. All this bishop wants to do on f1 is just stay safe and continue to attack this pawn here on a6. Now we're going to see the rook swing back. The rook's now going to come to d3. Again, a few moves from both sides, just kind of moving around. Anand's kind of nicely placing his pieces and more of attacking. Aronian on the other side, just kind of moving his pieces back and forth. Doesn't really have a strong attack, doesn't have any weak pieces that Anand has that he can attack or really do much with. So he's somewhat playing defensive, just kind of moving his pieces around, waiting for Vishy to make a mistake. The rook swings over here to d8, trying to control both this d and e file right here. Now bishop coming back here to e3, attacking. Knight swings back. Now the bishop comes back here to d2. Just in case the pawn wants to push forward to a5, he's still attacking that right there. Now the knight swings back here to f6, kind of opens up the door for the bishop to come to a5, attacking both the rook but also stopping this pawn from moving anywhere. Obviously, white wants to go ahead and attack that, so stopping that is very good. So great moves by Vishy and Anand, I think, going into the end game. The rook swinging over here to e8, and then the rook here to b6. And this is, again, a great move, as both this rook and this bishop here on f1 are both attacking this pawn on a6. Going to be very, very difficult for black to hold on to this. We now see the rook come over here attacking this bishop. The bishop is forced to come back, but he does have this nice little outpost here with his pawn here on b2. And then the knight's going to swing over here to d5, attacking the rook. The rook's going to be taken here on e5, and then this other rook's going to be taken here, and then the bishop comes back here to d4. Now Vishy and Anand actually decided to go about gaining this material in a very long and methodical way, but along the way it did end up proving to be very, very valuable. After the knight takes here on a4, then the rook's going to swing into c6 here, and we see the rook swing over here to d8. Now, there's a few different options as far as what white does here. In this particular case, you can kind of pause and see what you would do. I think one of the strongest moves is pawn here to b3. Again, this knight over here on a4 is really awkwardly placed. It can't go anywhere. Can't come here to b6 because it's being attacked by both of these pieces. Can't come to c5 or c3 or even b2 because of all these pieces, and this really puts it to the test right here. If the rook takes, that's not the biggest deal. Again, we can now take. We have both of our pieces attacking the pawn over here, so we still have options. In this particular game, the rook decided to come down here to c4. Now the bishop's going to come here to d6, protecting the knight now. And now we have the pawn pushing forward to b3. I think it's a move late, but all in all, it ended up working for Vishy Anand. Now the bishop's going to attack, and the rook swings over here. Now black has to be careful. He doesn't want to go ahead and take right away. If he decides to go ahead and take with his bishop right here, then the king can just come down on f1, and this knight's going to fall. It really can't do much. It doesn't matter where it goes, it's going to fall. And so in the particular game, black really only had one real move, and that is knight here to b2. White can't just take it right away with his bishop, because now the rook's going to come down to d2, check, go ahead and take this bishop and actually be able to come back in this game. So Vishy Anand, after knight here to b2, plays bishop taking here. The pawn, it can take, which it did in this particular game. Could also, if we wanted to, try to get pretty tricky, play pawn to a5, forcing this rook here to die. It can't go here to c4 or a4. It's going to be taken by the knight. If it stays there, it's going to be taken by the pawn. Either way, it's really not that great. Black's definitely in a losing position. Black decides to go ahead and take with his pawn. Now the king's going to come here to e3, protecting the bishop. After the rook check here on e8, we see, again, the king getting involved into the action. After the rook over here, the king to c3 is kind of a dagger. There's no way to stop this knight from dying. Again, it was just too awkwardly placed. And so Aronian, the #2 player in the world, the favorite to win this tournament, actually goes down in the first game. All three of the other matches ended in a draw, so Vishy Anand right away, the player that just gave up his title, came to this tournament hungry, got a win under his belt in the first match, which again, playing as white is something that you definitely want to do. So congrats to Anand. I'm excited for an amazing 2014 Candidates Tournament. Again, they do have a few days off, but every day there is a tournament. I will be making a video that night, so make sure you check back. Also on the website, if you want to watch or look at all the different games from that particular day, I will have that. So today I will have all 4 matches, so you can actually see the games if you're curious. Again, if you haven't already, like the Facebook page. The link's going to be in the description, so definitely check that out. And I'll see y'all guys in the next video. Thanks for watching.